Epona. Lots of people know her name. Lots of people know that she's a famous horse goddess, worshipped by the Celts and by the Romans. But what do we really know about her? One of the great dangers in the study of early Celtic people and in the way modern people approach Celtic religion is that our lack of true knowledge creates a bit of a blank page. And people feel like they can just write whatever they want on that page and call it Celtic. In this video, I'm going to stick to the facts and try and give you some context for Epona based on what we know. The Romans had a habit of adopting local deities wherever they went, but they incorporated them into their own style of religious practice. If that local deity reminded them of one of their own gods, they might change the name or use a double-barreled name like Apollo Maponos or Sulis Minerva. Once the Romans conquered a Celtic region, they were happy for the locals to carry on worshipping their own gods, but they were expected to do so in the Roman style. We have no way of knowing how the Celtic people felt about that. Was it a big change for them or a small one? It's within this set of circumstances that we get our knowledge of Epona. We know that Epona is a Celtic goddess, and we also know that she became very popular with the Romans. After all, horses and cavalry were very important in this era, and Epona is all about horses. But keep this in mind. The Epona we see is served up to us by the Romans, and we have no way of knowing how close this Epona is to the way the Celtic people understood her. Epona is the most widely attested of all the Celtic goddesses, with over 300 inscriptions and artifacts. There are hundreds of Celtic deities, but many of them are only known from one inscription or from a single passage of text. So Epona actually is a very big deal, but as usual, we don't know whether that was mostly because the Romans were so fond of her or whether she was equally popular with the pre-Roman Celtic people. Let's start with her name. The root epo means horse. The on part signifies greatness and has supernatural or deific connotations. The a ending tells us that this is a feminine name. So we might translate this name as horse goddess or divine mare. These are typical depictions of Epona, but I'd say they represent Roman ideas and ideals, not necessarily Celtic ones. Until the Celts became Romanized, their practices didn't create much in the way of lasting evidence of their religion. One thing we do have from the ancient Celts are coins. There is a whole field of study that attempts to get inside the heads of different cultural groups by studying their coins. However, theories come and go and probably reflect the mindset of the observer as much as that of the makers of the coins themselves. What we can definitely say is that here are 3 coins showing female riders. They're naked, and that could be to make sure that we know they're female, or it could be because some Celtic warriors did go into battle naked. On the left, the woman carries a sword or spear and a shield, and there's a lyre below her and some stars above her. The coin on the right shows a woman in a fancy helmet. The Celts sometimes wore helmets with horns or animals on them. There are some strange symbols on this one, which I'm not going to try to interpret. In the center, this woman looks really exuberant. She's either in the early stages of pregnancy or has borne children, and the coin maker thinks it's worth putting this detail in. She possibly carries a bow. There's something below her which looks like a being with wings. But does this tell us anything about Epona? There's no evidence that this is meant to be Epona, although it's possible. What it does tell us is that the Celts had very different ideas about women and their role in warfare and as riders. This is possibly my favorite ancient figure of Epona. She appears sweet and serene, rather benevolent. She sits modestly aside the horse. Is this how the Celts saw Epona before Roman influence? We can't really answer that question. Because the Roman Empire was so significant in spreading the cult of Epona, it's worth looking at their own goddesses and how that might have influenced their perception of Epona. Roman ideas about womanhood were obviously different from those of the Celts, for example. Roman women didn't go to war. They were expected to care for their households and children. Modesty and propriety were important, and the Eponas we see depicted are often quite matronly. The Romans took most of their deities from Greek religion and usually renamed them. The Greek Hera, or Roman Juno, was a queenly goddess. Not a sovereignty goddess in exactly the Celtic sense, but close. She looked after wealth and fertility and protected the people, so she is sometimes depicted with a spear. But she's no warrior. The spear is probably more of a symbol of who she is than anything. Sometimes it seems like Epona is just Juno with a horse to the Romans. Poseidon, who we think of as a sea deity, began as a horse-like river god in early Greek religion, and he slowly morphed into a deity related to the sea. Neptune was his Roman equivalent, and he continues to carry some equine associations. He also seems to overlap with a god called Consus, who was associated with horse racing, and was sometimes called Neptune Equestris. Demeter was a Greek goddess associated with the harvest, particularly the grain harvest. In her myth, Demeter was pursued by Poseidon, who wanted to rape her. She took the form of a mare in an attempt to escape, but Poseidon turned into a stallion, and he did rape her. This probably reflects Poseidon's equine origins. Ceres, the Roman counterpart to Demeter, was also connected to grain and the harvest and to motherhood. It's possible that the depictions we see of Epona with baskets of grain and agricultural produce come from Roman ideas about Demeter and Ceres, rather than from Celtic ideas about Epona. So, although we can see various deities in the Roman pantheon who share some attributes with Epona, there was still a big Epona-shaped gap in Roman religion, just waiting to be filled. There are also some Roman texts which mention Epona. This passage is from a satire called The Golden Ass. The hero of the story, called Lucius, has been transformed by magic into an ass, that is, a donkey, and has been told that he can only become human again by eating roses. He finds some roses unexpectedly in a stable. These thoughts were interrupted by my catching sight of a statue of the goddess Epona, seated in a small shrine centrally placed, where a pillar supported the roof beams in the middle of a stable. The statue had been devotedly garlanded with freshly picked roses. This is describing something quite specific. Of course, we can't be sure that this was a common practice, but it might suggest that some of the small, portable Epona figurines that had been found were not household objects at all, but were kept in stables. That, in turn, suggests to me that Epona has an aspect as a protector of horses. This next quote is a bit problematic. It's from a text called the Paralela Minora, which was once attributed to Plutarch, but now known as Pseudo-Plutarch. The Paralela Minora, or Greek and Roman parallel stories, is something of a mystery. The author has been described by modern scholars as a fool writing in an atrocious style, while others suspect that the piece was intended as a satire on the real Plutarch. The text offers similar or parallel stories from Greek and Roman traditions. The action of the stories features gruesome violence and plenty of scandalous sexual liaisons, including incest and bestiality. This context is often missed by modern writers looking for an interesting angle on Epona. The quote appears on the internet and in books, and people take it at face value. This is the part we generally see. Fulvius Stellus hated women, and used to consort with a mare, and in due time the mare gave birth to a beautiful girl, and they named her Epona. She is the goddess that is concerned with the protection of horses. So Agesilaus in the 3rd book of his Italian history. In other words, this author is quoting Agesilaus. But what is the Greek parallel? Because that's the structure of the text. Well, it's this. Aristonomus of Ephesus, the son of Demostratus, hated women, and used to consort with an ass, and in due time the ass gave birth to a very beautiful maiden, Onescelus by name. So Aristocles in the 2nd book of his Strange Events. Knowing all this, I don't think it's wise to take the story seriously as a useful piece of information about Epona. Yet I see it subjected to all kinds of interpretations as if it's a piece of religious writing, but the story seems unsatisfactory in other ways, too. Fulvius Stellus is presented as a mortal man, and the unnamed mare is presumably just a normal horse. So how does their offspring come to be a goddess? Is it just that such a birth is impossible within the laws of nature and hence supernatural? Or is this just an amateurish attempt to explain a goddess whose myth is unknown? If we consider Epona to be of Celtic origin, then any Greek or Roman attempt to explain her birth is likely to be a construction. Possibly the most interesting thing here is that Epona is seen as a protector of horses. Coming up, we'll look more closely at artifacts associated with Epona. If you like my videos, please share them, comment, or give them a thumbs up. There's more free content on my Patreon page and on my website. If you're feeling spontaneous, you could buy me a cuppa on Ko-fi right now. All the links are below this video. Celtic-speaking people once covered vast swathes of Europe. Obviously, these modern countries and borders didn't exist at the time, but it's a good way to get a sense of where Celtic people once lived. This map will give you an idea of how widespread the worship of Epona was. These different colored dots show where artifacts, inscriptions, and even early textual references to Epona have been found. Let's zoom in and look at what was found at this place called Guirizzolo in northern Italy. This fragment of a calendar shows the 18th of December as being the feast day of Epona. Guirizzolo is way up here, very long way from Rome. It's likely that this holiday was more of a local thing. I'd expect that if it was celebrated in Rome, or celebrated by Romans generally, that there would be some mention of it, which there's not. This is the corner of the calendar that mentions Epona. I've just highlighted it a bit here. This is what it means. XV 15 Calendus Januarius. The way the Romans wrote dates, this would be 15 days before the 1st of January. In other words, the 18th of December. Some modern followers of Epona also use this day to honor her. Finally, let's look at how Epona was depicted. This imperial style is more common in temples, and it may answer a need to elevate Epona from a simple protectress of horses to something more impressive. A way for Rome's horsemen to imitate cults which were out of reach to all but the highest echelons of Roman military society. Equally, it may simply reflect a more sedate version of a goddess who was already viewed as having queenly attributes by the Celts. These are the ones I meant when I said they are a bit like how Juno is often depicted. But it's also interesting that Epona is usually feeding horses in these. She often has a patera, a Roman offering dish, in her lap, and the horses appear to be eating something from it. This might give us some idea of her function in providing for horses or caring for them. Unlike the riders on the Celtic coins we looked at, these statues of Epona are riding in the fashion of Roman women. They are often called side saddle Eponas, but they are actually sitting in a position sometimes called a side, as opposed to astride. The modern side saddle, with the thing you hook your leg around, didn't exist yet. What they did have was a kind of pad or sometimes a seat, often with a little platform for the feet. These Eponas carrying baskets of food are also common, and these are the ones that I said might be influenced by ideas of Demeter and Ceres. The Romans invaded Britain in the 1st century, and they left their typical military-style altars behind, especially in areas where they had a lot of fortresses. The altar on the left is from Auchindevi on the Antonine Wall. It's dedicated to Mars, Minerva, the goddesses of the parade ground, Hercules, Epona, and victory. The altar was paid for by a centurion of the 2nd Legion Augusta in fulfillment of a vow. There's another altar dedicated to Epona on Hadrian's Wall. In Roman religion, you typically made a vow to pay for an altar or even a temple. This might be on some condition, like surviving a battle, and if that condition was met, you fulfilled your vow to the god by having the work done. The Roman cavalry's worship of Epona may have started with members of Celtic tribes who became Roman soldiers. They may have brought Epona with them, but her worship soon spread through the Roman cavalry more generally. It's interesting to see how the Roman cavalry barracks were organized. For a long time, archaeologists wondered where the Romans kept their horses. They found barracks, but no stable blocks, so they thought the horses must have been kept in paddocks. That would create a lot of problems with wet horses, especially in Britain. Recently, a more careful examination of cavalry barracks has shed some light on this. Each section of the barracks housed 3 men and their horses together in a kind of apartment. The men had to walk through the horses' stalls to get to their own sleeping space, which was separated by a low wall. Presumably, the horses were tied. There was a drain in the floor to carry the horse urine away, and this was the thing which finally allowed the archaeologists to make sense of things. These men were living incredibly close to their horses, and perhaps this created close ties, which also encouraged devotion to Epona. It's frustrating that we know so little about how Celtic-speaking people related to Epona. It's tempting to draw inferences from the stories of Macha or Rhiannon, two goddesses who are also associated with horses. If that's correct, then the Celtic Epona might have been a sovereignty goddess associated with the heartland of central Gaul. This is the region with by far the most Epona artifacts and inscriptions. Alesia in particular seems to have been associated with horses, horse breeding, and the making of chariots and horse equipment. There's even a story that when the Romans were about to attack Alesia, the Celtic leader, the great Vercingetorix, freed most of his own army's horses so that they wouldn't be captured by the Romans. Sadly, he was defeated, and perhaps the greatest prize the Romans took was Epona herself. Rhiannon is very much a territorial goddess of sovereignty, but she's not directly associated with war. Her other associations are more toward prosperity, agricultural bounty, and motherhood. Macha appears to be a sovereignty goddess too. She does have a warrior aspect. In the Taun, she even appears to provide chariot horses for the hero, Cuchulainn. Does this take us back to the wild warrior women on the early coins? The truth is, we can't be sure. Beyond her protection of horses, Epona remains something of an enigma.